Welcome to IVF This, episode 176, IVF and Emotional Muscle Memory. Welcome to IVF This. I'm your host, Emily Ginn. After 10 years of primary and secondary infertility due to both male and female factor infertility, I am now the mother to 3 beautiful miracles. I am married to my favorite person in the world. I'm a social worker, a life coach, and an IVF warrior. I'm here to teach you how to manage your mind and emotions during your IVF journey, to break free from anxiety and regain control of your life, even in the midst of infertility. I'm going to teach you how to say IVF this to how we think about, talk about, and experience infertility. Let's go. Hello, my beautiful friends. I hope you're all doing so well today. We're going to get right to it. So today we're going to talk about something that most of us have experienced, but maybe haven't had a word for it before, and that's emotional muscle memory, right? So this is something I see a lot with my coaching clients all the time. And if I'm being honest, I've totally experienced it firsthand as well, because anything that you guys have going through or have gone through, I've probably gone through, especially if it pertains to like how we think about things and how we feel. Our emotions, just like our bodies, develop habits, reflexes. And those habits and reflexes become incredibly ingrained over time. We talk about neural pathways on this podcast, and that's kind of what we're talking about, right? And so for those of us navigating IVF and infertility, that emotional conditioning can sometimes feel really hard to break, whether it's walking into that experience with some deeply ingrained emotional habits and reflexes, or if it's developed over time over your infertility IVF journey, right? Either way is applicable. And I think to a certain degree, all of us experience the former, right? The one that we come with our life experiences, with social conditioning, things like that. So today we're going to explore what emotional muscle memory is from both a psychological and a neurological perspective. We're going to talk about how it can work against you, like especially if you've been through repeated losses, repeated disappointments, a long, arduous journey, and then how we can retrain our emotional responses so that they work for us instead of against us. Okay, so let's get into it. Emotional muscle memory. If you've heard this before, you've probably had it correlated or connected with like physical muscle memory. Like in that sense, when people type on a keyboard without looking, that's an example of physical muscle memory. Or maybe driving the same route home or to the office or wherever without even thinking about it. That happens because over time, our brain optimizes repetitive tasks, right? So you don't have to consciously think about them. It's part of our brain's motivational triad. I did a whole episode on it, but essentially it's the 3 things that your brain is always looking for. And that's to seek pleasure, avoid pain, and be as efficient as possible. So for what we're talking about, it's that be as efficient as possible. That's what our brain is doing in regards to physical and emotional muscle memory. And our emotions work the same way as just free typing on the keyboard without looking at it, driving the same route over and over without even thinking. Our emotions work the exact same way. Your brain learns patterns of emotional responses just like it learns patterns of movement. When you repeatedly experience a very strong emotion in similar-ish situation, your brain then encodes that response into a neural pathway, creating an emotional shortcut, right? Because it's one of the things that our brain is best at, creating shortcuts. So if you know me, I like to break it down, what's happening in your brain and why. I always feel like it's helpful to better understand that you're not crazy. I could dance around it, but that you're not crazy. You aren't some sort of Debbie Downer who can never experience joy or happiness again, right? There is a psychological, physiological, and evolutionary reason behind why our brain does this. So let's get into the brain's role of emotional muscle memory, right? So at the heart of this process, this emotional muscle memory, creating these shortcuts, are 3 things: the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the prefrontal cortex. If you have listened to this podcast for a while, you have probably heard me talk about one or all three of those in various other episodes. And that's because these are the three like gang leaders within your brain around your thought processes. Okay. So the amygdala, that's the brain's like emotional alarm system, detecting threats, triggering emotional responses like fear, anxiety, sadness. If you've ever experienced a painful event, loss of a loved one, within the context of IVF, it would be like a failed cycle, miscarriage, or pregnancy loss, your amygdala remembers the distress and tries to warn you anytime a similar situation arises, right? Okay, so that's the amygdala. The hippocampus is the structure in your brain that's like the historian of your brain. If you've heard me talk about how our brain it can't see into the future, right? Unless you're a clairvoyant. It can only reach into the past to help you figure out what you should do next, which is why new scenarios, new situations, that uncertainty feels so uncomfortable. The thing that creates those user manuals for us is the hippocampus, right? It stores contextual memories and links emotions to past events. If every IVF cycle is a reminder of disappointments, your hippocampus helps trigger anticipatory stress, anticipatory anxiety, the moment, let's say, you see an appointment notification or a medication reminder or something like that. It can be as innocuous as your clinic calling you or going to take your meds, right? If you're doing an injection that night and maybe you've had a lot of extremely disappointing experiences, it's going to tie those two things. It's going to couple the emotional response with the thing that it thinks it needs to warn you. Okay, so it's the amygdala and the hippocampus. The last one is the prefrontal cortex. This is the rational part of your brain. This is the part of your brain that doesn't even develop until you're like 26 years old. It's responsible for logic, reasoning, impulse control. Ideally, this part of your brain would step in and help you regulate emotions, right? That's what the prefrontal cortex was evolved to do, was to help us go from this very primitive, like just reactionary, instinctual, to give us more logic, to give us more, to give us a better ability to regulate things like our emotions, our thoughts, things like that. But when the emotional muscle memory is so strong, especially in traumatic experiences or trauma-related experiences, it can be overridden by the amygdala's survival instinct. The amygdala is a much older part of the brain. It's a much more primitive part of the brain. So it has the power to override the newer part of the brain, which is the prefrontal cortex. Okay. So now that we know that what's happening in our brains, I want to stop and talk about how, as efficient as muscle memory is, emotionally or physically, it can work against us, right? And that's a lot of what we default on, is that part of our brain that is designed to actually help us can hinder us. Unbeknownst to the brain, which seems silly because the brain is kind of in on the whole thing. But trust me when I say the brain isn't trying to harm you. It's just doing what it knows to do, what it's evolved to do, right? So it can lead to what we call maladaptive emotional responses. Reactions that are or have been useful in the past, but aren't actually helpful in the present, right? And please note the word maladaptive, okay? It doesn't mean you're handling something badly or wrong, or that you're not handling anything, right? It means that you're trying to process the emotions and the experiences in a way that is no longer working in your benefit, right? It's just how you've done it in the past, but how you've done it in the past doesn't mean that that's the most beneficial thing moving forward, right? So, and that's, I think, where we want to focus on. We don't need to add a layer of judgment on yourself when everything else feels so heavy, right? So the first rule of thought work, we don't use it against ourselves. Ever. We never use it against ourselves. It is just about creating awareness and intentionally deciding how we want to react, okay? So let me give you a few examples for how it shows up, this emotional muscle memory. So one, anticipated grief. I've talked about anticipatory grieving before, and emotional shutdown. So what happens if you face multiple transfers, multiple disappointments, multiple losses. And like this can happen inside the context of infertility and outside the context of infertility. Like that's what I love about the work that I do, is that it's easily applicable across many different domains of your life. I always talk about it within the context of IVF because that's why we're here. It's called IVF this. But I want you to think about, like, you can think about this kind of from a global perspective around your life. So if you've experienced multiple disappointments, whether that's failed transfers, failed cycles, negative betas, miscarriage, things like that, your brain will automatically anticipate loss before even your next cycle begins. You might notice that you feel detached, emotionally shut down, or even numb, not because you don't care, but because your brain is trying to protect you from another devastating letdown. So he's trying to help you, right? Why? Because the amygdala learns to associate IVF with grief and stress. So to keep you safe, it activates defense mechanisms, suppressing hope and the emotional investment of the experience. This is your brain's way of saying, like, let's not go through that pain and disappointment again. It is, in fact, not some sort of well of universal truth saying that it's not going to work. It's simply your brain trying to put a stop sign in front, being like, we've had a lot of pain, we've had a lot of bad experiences, let's not do this again. So it's trying to get you to halt that, but it doesn't have some sort of like inner knowing. I want to make sure that that's understood, right? So the problem is that while this makes sense from a survival or an evolutionary perspective, it also means that you might struggle to feel excitement, connection, and hope, even when things may be going well. Number two would be hypervigilance and anxiety spirals, two things that you are all probably very well acquainted with. So what happens there? You find yourself on edge throughout your IVF cycles, scanning for potential problems, constantly checking symptoms, or obsessing over test results. Your body is in a near constant state of alert, as if something terrible, something dangerous is around the corner. That's because your nervous system has been trained to expect disappointment. The brain's prediction model, so to speak, assumes past pain will be repeated. So it keeps you in this heightened state of anxiety to, like, quote unquote, prepare for the worst. The problem inherent for this is this keeps you in fight or flight mode, where cortisol, the stress hormone, floods your system, making it even harder for you to feel grounded, rational, and hopeful. So if cortisol comes online, your prefrontal cortex is evacuated the building and your amygdala is now the one running the show. That's what I mean when I said earlier that your amygdala can override your prefrontal cortex. This is exactly why. So the third way that this shows up is avoidance of positive emotions. I talked about this in the episode titled The Fear of Hope. But what happens is you tell yourself, I can't get my hopes up, or I don't want to jinx it, or, don't count your eggs before they hatch, or whatever you might say to yourself, right? You might actively avoid imagining a positive outcome because the risk of the disappointment feels too great. Why? This is a classic case of emotional conditioning. Your brain has linked hope with pain. It is not that you are incapable or devoid of experiencing hope. It means that your brain has connected those two things and says, well, if we feel hope, then we're going to feel pain. So maybe if we avoid hope, we can avoid pain. Okay? So it associates excitement with potential devastation. Instead of risking another emotional letdown, your brain kind of nudges you towards emotional neutrality, or more commonly towards numbness or emotional detachment. This, of course, the problem with this is that it prevents us from feeling joy in any part of the process, in a lot of different areas of our life. Even though things might be going well, you might struggle to keep feeling happiness because your emotional muscle memory keeps bracing for the worst. And so it's so important for you to understand this. I'm going to say it again. When your emotional muscle memory is based on pain, disappointment, and grief, your brain will automatically start defaulting to these emotions, even when they're not necessary or relevant. And I hear a lot of clients talking about how they viewed their life, their body, their experiences, their marriage, their friendships before IVF and before miscarriage, before all the pain and grief. And that's because you have a different set of experiences that you didn't have before. And so now your brain has been kind of retrained to anticipate that pain and that grief. But hear me when I say this, emotional muscle memory can be retrained. It trained you the first time, right? It trained you towards this more negative disappointment. Hope is not a safe thing. So it can be retrained. If it got trained one time, which has been trained many, many times over your entire lifetime, it can be retrained, right? Just like you teach your body a new way of movement, right? You can teach your brain new emotional reflexes. The more we consciously practice different emotional responses, the easier it can become to shift out of fear, shut down hypervigilance, and into a space of a little bit more balance, emotional flexibility, and resiliency. So that's what this last section is. Okay, I'm not going to leave you hanging with this. I want to help you understand how to make emotional muscle memory work for you rather than against you. So the first thing, I feel like if you've listened to this podcast before, you know what I'm going to say. Awareness. You have to notice the patterns. You have to be willing to look at the patterns and notice what that comes up, right? So you first start noticing when your emotional muscle memory kicks in. Do you tense up the moment you schedule a transfer? Do you feel sick with anxiety every time you see a pregnancy announcement? Do you shut down when someone asks you how you're feeling? Do you feel a sense of dread whenever you see your clinic's name pop up on your caller ID, or when you're, parking in their parking lot, or even just like this existential dread in an upcoming appointment, right? These are all clues. Your emotional muscle memory is at work. Noticing the pattern is the first step to changing it. Number 2 is slowing down the response. The sacred pause, where you can slow down your reaction time, and this helps retrain your brain to slow down on the responses, right? You pause your reaction so you can slow down and intentionally decide how you want to respond to a situation, right? Once you recognize the pattern, try to create some space between the trigger and your reaction. Instead of letting your automatic reactions take over, try pausing and ask yourself, what am I reacting to? Is this emotion coming from my present moment or my past experiences? Or even what else can be true? I love that question. I love asking myself, what's another way to look at this? Okay. Even just for a few seconds of pausing can help you rewrite your emotional response over time. Like, it doesn't have to be super dedicated work. I'm not asking you to journal for 4 hours a day. Even if we just take a few second pause, that will already start the process of you rewiring that part of your brain. And then you're going to introduce new patterns. If we want to retrain our emotional muscle memory, we need to practice new responses. So instead of shutting down when you start to feel hopeful, try letting yourself feel that hope, even if it's just for a few minutes. I talk about this concept called equal airtime, where if you are going to allow yourself to kind of wallow and be disappointed and being sad, that's not a problem. But you have to be willing to dedicate the exact same amount of time to feeling optimistic and hopeful and joyous, or even just like low levels, like committed, right? It doesn't have to be these super fuzzy, warm feelings. It can just be like grounded or neutral, okay? Even, again, and I can't emphasize this enough, even if it's just for a few minutes. Nobody is asking you for 100% happiness, 100% hope, 100% dedication all the time. That is wildly unrealistic, okay? Another example would be, instead of bracing for bad news, try neutrality. Instead of this won't work, try, I don't know what will happen, and that's okay. Like, I just don't have that information right now. I don't have enough information right now to know if it's going to work or not. And then instead of assuming the worst, try to look for small signs that could go right. That one's going to be a little bit trickier. I would strongly encourage you to focus on those first two, but that is an exercise that you can do. And then every time you do this, again, you're retraining your brain for new patterns. You're shifting emotional default settings. And then the last, but absolutely not least, you use your body to retrain your emotions. Because emotional muscle memory is stored in the body, we can also use body-based tools to help shift it. So deep breathing helps to reset the nervous system when our old responses kick in. Deep breathing or controlled relaxation breathing is one of the fastest ways to get out of fight or flight, because if you think about it, when you're in fight or flight, your breath will quicken and become more shallow. So deep breathing, slow, intentional deep breathing is actually a trigger for your brain to be like, oh, hey, we're actually not in danger, so we can slow down. Another one is tapping, or the emotional freedom technique. I've talked about this on a previous podcast. I even interviewed someone, a coach who works with EFT and things like that. I believe that episode was, I think, IVF and tapping with Sarah Holland. She's a fantastic coach. A lot of the work she does is around EFT. Movement, like walking or yoga, can help process stored emotional reactions. And then self-touch. You guys, you have probably seen me if you watch the videos, place my hand on my heart. That's a way that I self-touch for grounding and rewiring that emotional reaction. Arms crossed over your chest. Something that's usually a defensive posture, but it doesn't have to be. It can be a way to ground yourself. Back and forth tapping on your legs, on your chest, whatever's going to feel the most comfortable to you, can also signal to your body that you're safe. So even small shifts in your physical state can help shift your emotional patterns. So the goal is not to erase your emotional history. We can't. There's no way to go and erase all of your experiences, right? Your emotions have served a purpose. Your reactions to your emotions have served a purpose. They have protected you. They have kept you safe. They have helped you to survive. But now you get to decide how you move forward. So imagine what it would be like if your emotional default setting was self-compassion instead of self-doubt. If your first instinct was hope and resiliency instead of fear and dread. If emotional muscle memory wasn't something that worked against you, but something that held you up when things got hard. And that's possible. I want to assure you that that is entirely possible. It is not instant by any stretch of the imagination, but it is possible. And it starts with noticing, slowing down, and practicing new patterns. Okay, that is what I have for you today. I hope this episode gave you some insight into how emotional muscle memory works and shows up in your life and how you can begin to shift it. As always, be gentle with yourself in this process. Okay, changes take time, and I know you're doing an amazing job. You're already here. You're already listening to the podcast. Like that's an amazing first step in learning how to take care of yourself. Okay, so have a great week, and we'll talk soon. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of IVF This. If you like what you've heard, click subscribe and follow to make sure you don't miss an episode. And if you want to learn more, head over to www.ivfthiscoaching.com to learn how to work together.